EU.
My Lords, in the course of debates around the EU retained law bill, if people remember that, we have heard complaints from people across the House, largely from opposition parties, but also backbenchers from the government, who've said that it's outrageous to be asked to sign off legislation without a choice of scrutinising in detail those laws. Scrutinising decisions on whether to retain or discard laws, we've been told, need close parliamentary oversight and debate. So I have to say that I was somewhat taken aback that even before the publication of the Windsor framework, the opposition committed to supporting the government. Since then, skeleton documentation has been enough to have politicians across all parties vote en masse for the framework, despite the fact that actually that equates to voting blind on yet-to-be-written laws that will apply to the UK, that will not be scrutinised, let alone with an opportunity to oppose, by UK Parliament. And even here today, what we've been asked to do is to nod through an agreement that allows the EU, which we've left, to draft brand new EU laws to govern trade taking place solely within UK borders. There's been no outrage, though. We're just quite calmly accepting that the future rules on the movements of goods, plants, foodstuffs, medicines, parcels, packs and so on from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will be decided by direct regulation made in Brussels and yet voted on, not here, but in the European Parliament, all of which we will never get to scrutinise in the UK Parliament. I mean, you sort of couldn't make it up. It seems an ironic twist as well that those who want to have close oversight of the people who will have, close oversight of UK laws are, wait for it, the EU. Because under the framework, the EU is granted new rights through EU law to be consulted in advance of huge swathes of legislation on UK trade and tax legislation governing the UK economy, all to monitor the so-called competitive risks within the UK single market. So I think that we might suggest that something's gone a bit awry here, and certainly that the process should be scrutinised, our own process should be scrutinised. I think, rightly in this place, concerns are often raised about the overuse of statutory instruments, of delegated powers to the executive. Yet here we are, faced with a statutory instrument, and we're only even being able to look at one part of the framework in the stormont break. And there's no feasible way of changing anything. I mean, that's why I welcome the motion from Lord Morrow, because it gives us a chance to have a debate. I actually thought the noble Lord Hayne asked some important questions about delegated powers. But in the end, this House, the other House, Stormont, none of us have any way of challenging what is an important document about the conflict about which legal authority will govern the UK. And in the other place, it was reduced to a derisory 90-minute discussion. And the whole framework, if we can remind ourselves, was announced as a done deal at a press conference that put Ursula von der Leyen centre stage, and the UK Parliament, and never mind the public, reduced to bystanders. To top it all, many in Parliament opposed the Northern Irish Protocol. Do you remember that one? I was a supporter of the Northern Irish Protocol and was criticised. But undoubtedly, there were many more critics, particularly in this House, who said that the Northern Irish Protocol should be defeated. What killed off the Northern Irish Protocol Bill? Sorry, the Northern Irish Protocol Bill. What killed it off? Was it this homegrown, legitimate, democratic defeat of people who opposed it? No. it was dropped by the government at the request of the EU. Now, perhaps what I find most galling then is the double standards on this issue. Goodness knows there's been huge amounts of righteous fury over the idea, for example, of the Prime Minister willfully misleading Parliament over Partygate. Everybody's been up in arms. But whichever way you look at it, the overselling of the Windsor framework has been misleading. Like everyone, when I first heard of the changes, I was open-minded and hopeful. These were presented as a series of practical arrangements, even concessions that would resolve the problems of the protocol. And for many of us, by the way, who have argued since 2016 that issues around trade and the border could be resolved simply through using common sense and technical methods, we thought at last common sense has come back, right? But as details have emerged, we realised that that even the word misleading is a generous term. Because despite repeated boasts that, for example, 1,700 pages of EU laws have been removed from Northern Ireland, it's just not true. No EU laws have been disapplied at all, and this surely looks more serious than spin or PR. And we've already heard how the PR-friendly named Stormont break is a misnomer, because no break can be applied. It's such a high bar for that break to be pulled, it's virtually inoperable. And a misnomer as well, because it's not politicians from Stormont who could pull the break at all, but the UK government. Now, you might say, well, you would say that, Baroness Fox, because you're one of those pesky Brexity types. But don't worry, because you don't have to believe me at all. You don't have to trust what I'm saying, because the information I've supplied you with so far has come from the EU, who I know many of people here hold in very high esteem. It's fascinating to compare the government's explainer documents that are full of boasts and claims of major gains, and then to compare them to the much larger, rather drier, forensic EU explanations. Those two sets of documents are almost unrecognisable in describing the same issues. And daily we hear more. Again, from the EU, not from our own government. You've heard that a number of us have been following word by word the European Parliament's Agricultural Committee, which has suddenly become fascinating, which you might think is a misnomer. But because we've been following what's been happening in that committee, we now know about those agricultural inspections, about the controls at ports, about the 18 EU officials that need to be present to oversee operations of these controls. Well, that should be public knowledge. I mean, that should be the government telling us that, not us finding out from the EU's committees what they are going to do in this country. And how do those 18 EU officials standing there overseeing the operation of borders, how does that tally with the notion that millions of citizens in this country voted that the EU should have no interference in the internal workings of the UK? I'm also worried, and I'm getting to the end, about a new narrative I've picked up from the media, from pundits and so on, who have more or less said that basically we should move on, get Brexit done, and ignore those pesky, irritating DUPers. As has already been indicated, it sounds as though some of the government feel the same. It's usually followed by a knowing comment that who do they represent anyway, because the majority of people in the 6 counties voted Remain. But I'm really worried about the consequences of such an approach, because it's also true that the majority of Scotland voted Remain. But unless we're going to go down the route of London Mayor Sadiq Khan, who, if you remember, threatened that Remain voting London would declare UDI at one point, of course we do not want that kind of balkanisation of the country. But of course, I also recognise that no union can survive unless it has consent of its constituent parts. And if the Scottish people had voted to leave the union, I would have gone with them and supported them all the way. It's also true that there are people in Ireland who want a united Ireland. That's a perfectly legitimate desire. And those who are arguing for and arguing around a border poll, then, you know, let them, I wish them well in a way. Let's see how they get on. But these are absolutely, completely different matters to what we're discussing here today. Because I would not object to Scotland leaving the UK if it wanted to. I would, if there's a border poll and it goes that way, good luck to them, as I say. But when the UK, in 2016, voted in a referendum, it was asked as a whole. And everybody in the UK was told that this was the most important constitutional question of generations. They turned up in their millions, believing for once that their votes would count as individuals in deciding a decision for the United Kingdom as a whole. If we say that because a part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, no longer counts in the same way, is not equal in the same way, or that actually because the majority of part of the UK had a different approach to the EU, like Northern Ireland, that it's okay then to develop a new legal relationship with the EU, then surely the SNP will see this as it's okay to treat any UK-wide laws as dispensable, that they can ignore, to walk away. So I'm not interested in Northern Ireland so much, or the DUP so much, but I am interested in the democratic sovereign integrity of the United Kingdom for the purposes of honouring British UK voters. To those of you in the Tory ranks who sort of say, move on, this puts Brexit to bed, you know, done and dusted, all I can say is if you think this zombie version of Brexit with its business as usual sellout of sovereignty is what all those millions of people voted for, then it's no wonder that the government squandered that 80-seat majority. My goodness, this was a democratic revolt for politics done differently. This is politics done the same. Luckily, the voters are not the only are not going along with this. Whatever happens in this House, that genie is well and truly out of the bottle, and it will make itself felt in the future. In the meantime, I will support and vote for this fatal motion.
I regret the fact that I regret very much the fact that we're not able to debate the Windsor framework.